During World War II, Allied soldiers undoubtedly fought and defeated fascist regimes, namely Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Yet it is a misconception to cast those soldiers as equivalent to today's militant Antifa activists. The average British or American serviceman of the 1940s did not see himself as a crusading anti-fascist in the modern sense. He was fighting for king and country or for Uncle Sam, for national survival and duty rather than to advance a left-wing ideological agenda. In fact, the political and social values held by most Allied troops would today be considered quite traditional or conservative. For example, the United States military was still racially segregated during World War II, and the British Empire's soldiers fought to preserve their nation and way of life, with leaders like Winston Churchill who were staunch anti-communists and imperialists. It's important to remember that anti-fascism as a concept in the 1930s to 40s originated from the political left, notably the original anti-fascist action in the 1930s Germany, which was a communist-affiliated movement. By contrast, the broad Allied coalition in World War II spanned the political spectrum from left to right. Conservative patriots, apolitical draftees, and even imperial loyalists all found themselves on the anti-Nazi side by necessity. They fought fascist powers, but they were not engaged in Antifa street struggles to remake society. Rather, they were uniformed members of nation-state militaries fighting a conventional war. As historian Lily Rothman notes, Western governments after World War II even downplayed the contributions of communist and anarchist partisans to anti-fascist resistance during the war, especially as the Cold War began. In essence, being anti-Hitler in 1944 did not imply one endorsed the kind of radical egalitarian politics that today's Antifa espouse. Many Allied veterans went on to view communism and leftist extremism as the new threat after 1945, underscoring that their wartime unity against the Axis was not rooted in shared domestic politics, but in urgent necessity of defeating a common enemy. Far from being progressive social revolutionaries, the majority of Allied servicemen in World War II reflected the norms of their era, norms that are very conservative by today's standards. They believed in patriotism, national honour, and preserving their home society. For instance, British troops commonly expressed pride in protecting our way of life and the British Empire, and American GIs often talked of defending freedom and democracy in a broad sense, even as those concepts were understood in a 1940s context, which excluded many of the social freedoms assumed today. Many soldiers held traditional attitudes about gender roles, race, and nationalism that would put them on the rightward end of the political spectrum now. To illustrate, one US Marine veteran, Carl Sperling-Dekel, who served in World War II and lived to 100, reflected that much of what American soldiers fought for has gone down the drain, lamenting that the United States of today is not the country we had back then. His perspective highlights that the country we had during his youth was very different. It was more culturally unified, albeit less inclusive by modern measures, and rooted in values of the early to mid-20th century. Those values included a clear sense of national identity, respect for authority, and a social order that in retrospect was quite right-leaning on many issues, like racial segregation was law in the US, class distinctions and empire loyalty was still strong in Britain. In short, the World War II generation fought against fascist powers, but they were not fighting for a radically new social order. They believed they were preserving the best of the old one. It's therefore a stretch to label them the original Antifa because their motivations were rooted in patriotism and defending the status quo of their liberal democracies or even colonial monarchies, not in pursuing leftist revolutionary goals. As we shall see, many of these veterans later in life strongly disapproved of the liberal or multicultural or multiracial changes that occurred in their societies that they saved, an indication that their own politics were quite distant from those of modern anti-fascist activists. As decades passed after 1945, many World War II veterans grew outspoken about their disappointment in how the world and especially their home countries had changed. Nowhere is this more evident than in the candid voices collected by English journalist Nicholas Pringle. In the mid-2000s, Pringle became curious about what the British greatest generation thought of 21st century Britain. He reached out in newspapers asking war veterans a pointed question: are you happy with how your country has turned out? What do you think your fallen comrades would have made of life in 21st century Britain? The results were eye-opening. About 150 veterans wrote back, and Pringle compiled their letters into a 500-page book titled The Unknown Warriors. The overwhelming sentiment from these old soldiers and wartime workers was one of overt disillusionment. Was it worth it? Pringle asked one veteran, Sarah Robinson, about the war. Her answer, and the answer of many of her contemporaries, now in their 80s and 90s, was a resounding no. They despise what has become of Britain that they once fought to save. It's not our country anymore, she said in sorrow and anger. The striking sense of betrayal is illuminated throughout the veteran letters. Pringle noted that apart from the occasional bright spot, one letter described Britain as still the best country in the world, an outlier opinion that was, the overall tone is one of disillusionment. Many felt the ultimate sacrifice of their fallen friends had been squandered. Those who died would now be turning in their graves, several wrote, given what Britain has become today. What exactly upset these World War II heroes so much about the 21st century society? In their letters, they enumerated a host of grievances. A dominant theme was mass immigration and multiculturalism and multiracialism. Veterans bemoaned that the Britain of their youth, culturally homogenous and British ruled, had been fundamentally transformed. They had been told in the war that they were defending our way of life, only to see a post-war Britain where their way of life, in their view, had been sacrificed to accommodate a flood of new arrivals. One veteran bitterly observed that the people once warned if Hitler had won, we'd all be speaking German, but instead now Britain is filled with people speaking Punjabi, Arabic, and a cacophony of other alien languages. Such statements reveal a strong sense of cultural loss. These men and women felt their homeland was being taken over in a way they never agreed to. Indeed, immigration and demographic change were the number one complaint in Pringle's survey. All we fought for is being whittled down to accommodate people who have their own countries and customs, one ex-serviceman wrote, and who come here and tell us what to do. Another lamented, this country is taken over by foreigners who have no business to be here. Refugees and immigrants dictate their own rules and the government pays. My patriotism has gone out the window. Such frank frustration at immigrants would today be seen by leftists as xenophobic or racist, further evidence that these veterans' outlooks lie to the right of contemporary mainstream politics. Yet, for the veterans themselves, opposing mass immigration felt entirely consistent with what they fought for. During the war, we were told we were defending our way of life, they noted, and now that very way of life seemed unrecognizable in a multicultural post-colonial Britain. Beyond immigration, the veterans decried a laundry list of societal changes. They saw a breakdown of order, morality, and respect. Many complained about rising crime and incivility, contrasting it with the respectful, law-abiding society of their youth. One reminisced about the days when people kept the laws and were polite and courteous. We were contented and happy, only to ask despairingly, where is it now? Others targeted political correctness and liberal social policies. The do-gooders have a lot to answer for, wrote one ex-serviceman, blaming permissive attitudes for a decline in discipline and public decency. He and others railed against what they saw as the erosion of traditional British values, citing everything from lenient policing and the welfare state to compensation culture and the loss of Christian faith in public life. Crucially, many veterans explicitly voice regret about fighting in World War II at all, given these outcomes. Yes, I served 6 years for this country, but for what? Wrote one bitter British Army veteran. I shall be 90 years old soon and a very bitter man. It's a pity Hitler did not get here. This statement, wishing that Britain had lost the war, was followed by an even more direct admission. If I had my time over again, I would have never gone to war, and neither would many others I have spoken to. In other words, had he known Britain would turn into the society it is today, the veteran would have preferred not to fight for it at all. Such sentiments were not isolated. Another veteran put it even more starkly, saying his main regret in life was that I didn't fight for Hitler. At least he was for his own people. This quote, an Allied veteran wistfully wishing he had fought for the Fuhrer, encapsulates how betrayed some of these individuals felt by the country they ended up with after the war. It underscores that the measures of success was not simply that Britain be on the winning side, but that Britain remained the country they loved. In their eyes, victory in 1945 had been followed by a slow defeat from within, as Britain lost its identity. Not every World War II veteran shares this view, of course, but Pringle's collection suggests a majority of those who responded were unhappy with 21st century Britain. One summation of the book notes that while a few veterans expressed appreciation for modern improvements like higher material living standards or the end of old class snobbery, the prevailing tone of their letters is one of bitterness over what had become of a country they had once cherished. This phrase, "this is not the country I fought for," appears time and time again. For example, a former British soldier, M.J. George, wrote, "I have never felt so disappointed or out of tune with society as I am now. Uncontrolled immigration, political correctness, lack of discipline. This is not the country I fought for. If I was younger, I'd seriously consider immigrating." Sad, isn't it? These men and women honoured the memory of fallen comrades, but some concluded that those sacrifices were not worth it in light of what became of Britain. This chorus of disillusionment isn't limited to the UK. Similar feelings have been voiced by some American World War II veterans. In recent years, viral clips have shown 100-year-old US veterans tearfully saying that modern America is not what we fought for. For instance, Carl Deckel, the Marine mentioned earlier, said, "The things we fought for and the boys that died for it, it's all gone down the drain," expressing sorrow that no one will have the America I had. That's not what they died for. Likewise, in Britain this November in 2025, a D-Day veteran named Alec Penstone shocked television hosts by declaring on Good Morning Britain that the sacrifice of World War II wasn't worth the result, given the state of the country today. Standing at a remembrance ceremony in Normandy, looking at the rows of white gravestones of his fallen friends, Penstone said bluntly, "Hundreds of my friends gave their lives for what? The country of today? No, I'm sorry, that sacrifice wasn't worth it." When pressed, he added, "What we fought for was our freedom. Even now, it's a darn sight worse than what I fought for it." Such testimony from the very men who served lends weight to the notion that the World War II generation is not in harmony with the trajectory of the modern world. Many feel the ideals and conditions of society they defended have been lost or betrayed. These first-hand accounts from World War II veterans demolish any romantic idea that they were the spiritual forefathers of today's anti-fascist street activists. In truth, a great number of Allied veterans harbour disdain for what they see as the liberal, permissive, or multicultural society that emerged after the war. Far from patting modern activists on the back for fighting fascism anew, they are more likely to scold them for tearing down the very traditions and national identities they once fought to preserve. Given the perspectives I've illustrated above, it's clear the values of many World War II Allied veterans clash sharply with those of contemporary Antifa activists. Antifa in modern terms refers to loosely organised far-left militant groups who oppose what they deem to be fascism, racism, and right-wing ideology in society. Antifa activists often espouse ideas of social equality, multiculturalism, multiracialism, anti-nationalism, and anti-capitalism, and they sometimes use aggressive protest tactics to shut down speakers or groups they view as fascist. Their roots, as noted, lie in leftist movements. Historically, self-styled anti-fascists were often communists or anarchists, positioning themselves against fascist and Nazi groups in the 1920s and 40s. Now consider the World War II vets' viewpoint detailed above. Opposition to immigration, desire for cultural homogeneity, nostalgia for traditional social hierarchies, and anger at liberal social changes. In today's political language, these positions would have placed these veterans far to the right. Indeed, some of their opinions expressed, such as longing for an ethnically uniform nation or sympathizing with the idea of having sided with Hitler, are even beyond the pale of mainstream conservatism and veer into ultra-nationalism. These are precisely the kinds of attitudes that modern Antifa groups aim to combat. An Antifa protester in 2025 is more likely to label a man like T.W. Earl, the veteran who wrote "I regret not fighting for Hitler," as a fascist Nazi or racist enemy, rather than hail him as a comrade in arms. The irony is glaring. While Antifa pride themselves on fighting fascism like the World War II generation did, many actual members of that World War II generation would find themselves condemned by Antifa's criteria due to their candidly nationalist or anti-immigrant beliefs. Historically, when World War II ended, Western Allied nations did not encourage vigilante anti-fascist purges. Instead, they rebuilt nations, and during the Cold War, many former fascists were rehabilitated as anti-communist allies. Meanwhile, domestic communists or extremist groups, even those who had fought Nazis, were often suppressed. For example, Britain in the late 1940s and 50s still had a very conservative social order. far-left agitators were viewed with suspicion. A number of World War II veterans themselves took up arms against communist insurgencies or leftist movements in the post-war years, such as in Greece and Korea, showing that they did not see fascism as the only enemy of freedom. Their commitment was to their nation's interest and stability, not to a never-ending ideological crusade against the far right. Modern Antifa, however, frames its activism as a continuation of the struggle against fascism in any form, including what they perceive in present-day nationalist or far-right movements. In doing so, they often invoke World War II symbolism, for instance, calling themselves the inheritors of the fight against Hitler. It's not uncommon to see signs or social media posts insisting your grandfather fought the Nazis, now it's your turn, equating World War II veterans with today's anti-fascist protesters. But the veterans' own words, however, strongly reject that equivalence. Far from welcoming a new generation fighting fascism on home soil, many of them regard today's society shaped by progressive ideals since the 1960s as something akin to what they were fighting against. Recall the veteran who wrote, "We are becoming colonized by immigrants. The Holocaust is now being carried out on us." Such a worldview is utterly at odds with the anti-racist, pro-diversity stance of Antifa. The notion that World War II Allied soldiers were the original Antifa is a poor fit for historical reality. Yes, those soldiers fought and defeated fascist governments in the 1940s, but they did so in the service of nations and ideals that do not line up with what modern anti-fascist activists champion. The typical Allied veteran came home believing he had preserved his country's way of life. As we've seen, many were later dismayed by how that way of life changed. Their grievances, ranging from immigration to moral permissiveness, show that their vision of freedom that they fought for was very different from the vision of freedom held by today's leftist activists. A veteran like Alec Penstone recalls fighting for our freedoms in World War II, but now feels that freedom has eroded in a Britain that is a darn sight worse than the past. Meanwhile, an Antifa protester today might argue that true freedom has only expanded through civil rights, multiculturalism, etc., and must be defended from reactionaries. They are talking past each other, separated by a chasm of historical experiences and ideology. Ultimately, invoking the World War II generation as a moral justification for Antifa's actions is at best an oversimplification and at worst an appropriation that World War II veterans would angrily reject. The Allied troops of World War II were anti-fascist by circumstance, but not anti-fascist by the same way the term is used today. Their primary identity was as patriotic citizen soldiers, not as revolutionaries. In fact, as mentioned, many of them lived to express regret over the very societal transformation that self-described anti-fascists today celebrate. So the next time someone says, "My grandfather fought the fascists in World War II, so I'm just like him by fighting fascism today," it's worth pausing to consider how that grandfather really felt about the world he helped create. The historical evidence suggests many from that generation would bristle at being linked to the tactics and beliefs of Antifa. In their eyes, they saved the world in 1945, and it is today's world that has betrayed them. Such is the tragic paradox of history. Those who fought actual fascism did so for a future that turned out far different from what they had imagined, and they would not necessarily endorse the battles being waged in their name today.